Hello, my name is Gav Cross, and I'm a storyteller. But I like to read supernatural stories on Twitch, live. And that's what I'm doing right now. It's Monday, it's 9 p.m, and I'm reading a story, though you might be watching this back on YouTube. Thank you if you are. Thank you if you're watching this live. Now, I don't look at the chat during the story, but after the story, we have a chat about the story. I'm going to read from the old St. Michael, Marks and Spencer's, 65 Tales of Horror. It's one of those haunted books. Ooh. And I'm going to read you the story Miriam by Truman Capote. For several years, Mrs. H.T. Miller had lived alone in a pleasant apartment, 2 rooms with a kitchenette, in a remodeled brownstone near the East River. She was a widow. Mr. H.T. Miller had left a reasonable amount of insurance. Her interests were narrow. She had no friends to speak of, and she rarely journeyed farther than the corner grocery. The other people in the house never seemed to notice her. Her clothes were matter-of-fact, her hair iron grey, clipped and casually waved. She did not use cosmetics. Her features were plain, inconspicuous, and on her last birthday she was 61. Her activities were seldom spontaneous. She kept the 2 rooms immaculate, smoked an occasional cigarette, prepared her own meals, and tended a canary. Then she met Miriam. It was snowing that night. Mrs. Miller had finished drying the supper dishes and was thumbing through an afternoon paper when she saw an advertisement of a picture playing at a neighborhood theater. The title sounded good, so she struggled into her beaver coat, laced her galoshes, and left the apartment, leaving one light burning in the foyer. She found nothing more disturbing than the sensation of darkness. The snow was fine, falling gently, not yet making an impression on the pavement. The wind from the river cut only at street crossings. Mrs. Miller hurried, her head bowed, oblivious as a mole borrowing a blind path. She stopped at a drugstore and bought a packet of peppermints. A long line stretched in front of the box office. She took her place at the end. There would be, a tired voice groaned, a short wait for all seats. Mrs. Miller rummaged in her leather handbag till she collected exactly the correct change for admission. The line seemed to be taking its own time, and looking around for some distraction, she suddenly became conscious of a little girl standing under the edge of the marquee. Her hair was the longest and strangest Mrs. Miller had ever seen, absolutely silver white, like an albino's. It flowed waist-length in smooth, loose lines. She was thin and fragilely constructed. There was a simple, special elegance in the way she stood with her thumbs in the pockets of a tailored plum velvet coat. Mrs. Miller felt oddly excited when the little girl glanced towards her. She smiled warmly. The little girl walked over and said, "Would you care to do me a favor?" "I'd be glad to, if I can," said Mrs. Miller. "Oh, it's quite easy. I merely want you to buy a ticket for me. They won't let me in otherwise. Here, I have the money." And gracefully she handed Mrs. Miller 2 dimes and a nickel. They went into the theatre together. An usherette directed them to a lounge. In 20 minutes the picture would be over. "I feel like a genuine criminal," said Mrs. Miller gaily as she sat down. "I mean, that sort of thing's against the law, isn't it? I do hope I haven't done the wrong thing. Your mother knows where you are, dear. I mean, she does, doesn't she?" The little girl said nothing. She unbuttoned her coat and folded it across her lap. Her dress underneath was prim and dark blue. A gold chain dangled about her neck, and her fingers, sensitive and musical-looking, toyed with it. Examining her more attentively, Mrs. Miller decided the truly distinctive feature was not her hair, but her eyes. They were hazel, steady, lacking any childlike quality whatsoever, and because of their size, seemed to consume her small face. Mrs. Miller offered a peppermint. "What's your name, dear?" "Miriam," she said, as though in some curious way it were information already familiar. "Why, isn't that funny? My name's Miriam, too, and it's not a terribly common name either. Now, don't tell me your last name's Miller." "Just Miriam." "But isn't that funny?" "Moderately," said Miriam, and rolled the peppermint on her tongue. Mrs. Miller flushed and shifted uncomfortably. "You have such a large vocabulary for such a little girl." "Do I?" "Well, yes," said Mrs. Miller, hastily changing the topic to, "Do you like the movies?" "I really wouldn't know," said Miriam. "I've never been before." Women began filling the lounge. The rumble of the newsreel bombs exploded in the distance. Mrs. Miller rose, tucking her purse under her arm. "I guess I'd better be running now if I want to get a seat," she said. "It was nice to have met you." Miriam nodded, ever so slightly. It snowed all week. Wheels and footsteps moved soundlessly on the street as if the business of living continued secretly behind a pale but impenetrable curtain. In the falling quiet there was no sky or earth, only snow lifting in the wind, frosting the window glass, chilling the rooms, deadening and hushing the city. At all hours it was necessary to keep a lamp lighted, and Mrs. Miller lost track of the days. Friday was no different from Saturday, and on Sunday she went to the grocery. Closed, of course. That evening she scrambled eggs and fixed a bowl of tomato soup. Then, after putting on a flannel robe and cold creaming her face, she propped herself up in bed with a hot water bottle under her feet. She was reading the Times when the doorbell rang. At first she thought it must be a mistake, and whoever it was would go away. But it rang, and settled to a persistent buzz. She looked at the clock. A little after 11. It did not seem possible. She was always asleep by 10. Climbing out of bed, she trotted barefoot across the living room. "I'm coming. Please be patient." The latch was caught. She turned it this way and that way, and the bell never paused an instant. "Stop it!" The bolt gave way, and she opened the door an inch. "What in heaven's name?" "Hello," said Miriam. "Oh, why, hello," said Mrs. Miller, stepping hesitantly into the hall. "You're that little girl." "I thought you'd never answer, but I kept my finger on the button. I knew you were home. Aren't you glad to see me?" Mrs. Miller did not know what to say. Miriam, she saw, wore the same plum velvet coat, and now she also had a beret to match. Her white hair was braided in 2 shining plaits and looped at the ends with enormous white ribbons. "Since I'd waited so long, you could at least let me in," she said. "It's awfully late." Miriam regarded her blankly. "What difference does that make? Let me in. It's cold out here, and I have on a silk dress." Then, with a gentle gesture, she urged Mrs. Miller aside and passed into the apartment. She dropped her coat and beret on a chair, and was indeed wearing a silk dress. White silk, in February. The skirt was beautifully pleated, and the sleeves long. It made a faint rustle as she strolled about the room. "I like your place," she said. "I like the rug. Blue's my favorite color." She touched a paper rose in a vase on a coffee table. "Imitation," she commented. "How sad. Aren't imitations sad?" She seated herself on the sofa, daintily spreading her skirt. "What do you want?" asked Mrs. Miller. "Sit down," said Miriam. "It makes me nervous to see people stand." Mrs. Miller sank to a hassock. "What do you want?" she repeated. "You know, I don't think you're glad I came." For a second time, Mrs. Miller was without an answer. Her hand motioned vaguely. Miriam giggled and pressed back on a mound of chintz pillows. Mrs. Miller observed that the girl was less pale than she remembered. Her cheeks were flushed. "How did you know where I lived?" Miriam frowned. "That's no question at all. What's your name?" "What's mine?" "But I'm not listed in the phone book." "Oh, let's talk of something else." Mrs. Miller said, "Your mother must be insane to let a child like you wander around at all hours of the night in such ridiculous clothes. She must be out of her mind." Miriam got up and moved to a corner where a covered birdcage hung from a ceiling chain. She peeked beneath the cover. "It's a canary. Would you mind if I wake him? I'd like to hear him sing." "Leave Tommy alone," said Mrs. Miller anxiously. "Don't you dare wake him." "Certainly. But I don't see why I can't hear him sing." And then said, "Haven't you anything to eat? I'm starving. Even milk and a jam sandwich would be fine." "Look," said Mrs. Miller, rising from the hassock. "Look, if I make some nice sandwiches, will you be a good child and run along home? It's past midnight, I'm sure." "It's snowing, and cold, and dark," reproached Miriam. "Well, you shouldn't have come here to begin with," said Mrs. Miller, struggling to control her voice. "I can't help the weather. If you want anything to eat, you'll have to promise to leave." Miriam brushed a braid against her cheek. Her eyes were thoughtful, as if weighing the proposition. She turned towards the birdcage. "Very well. I promise." "How old is she? 10, 11? Mrs. Miller in the kitchen unsealed a jar of strawberry preserves and cut 4 slices of bread. She poured a glass of milk and paused to light a cigarette. "Why has she come?" Her hand shook as she held the match, fascinated till it burned her finger. The canary was singing as he did in the morning, and no other time. Miriam, I told you not to disturb Tommy." There was no answer. She called again. All she heard was the canary. She inhaled the cigarette and discovered she had lighted the cork tip end, and, oh, really, she mustn't lose her temper. She carried the food in on a tray and set it on the coffee table. She saw first that the birdcage still wore its night cover, and Tommy was singing. It gave her a queer sensation. And no one was in the room. Mrs. Miller went through an alcove leading to her bedroom. At the door she caught her breath. What are you doing?" Miriam glanced up. In her eyes there was a look that was not ordinary. She was standing by the bureau, a jewel case open before her. For a minute she studied Mrs. Miller, forcing her eyes to meet, and she smiled. "There's nothing good here, but I like this." Her hand held a cameo brooch. "It's charming. Suppose perhaps you'd better put it back," said Mrs. Miller, feeling suddenly the need of some support. She leaned against the door frame. Her head was unbearably heavy. A pressure weighted the rhythm of her heartbeat. The light seemed to flutter defectively. "Please, child, a gift. A gift from my husband. But it's beautiful, and I want it," said Miriam. "Give it to me." As she stood, striving to shape a sentence which would somehow save the brooch, it came to Mrs. Miller there was no one to whom she might turn. She was alone, a fact that had not been among her thoughts for a long time. Its sheer emphasis was stunning. But here in her own home, in the hushed snow city, were evidences she could not ignore. She knew with startling clarity she could not resist. Miriam ate ravenously, and when the sandwiches and milk were gone, her fingers made cobweb movements over the plate, gathering crumbs. The cameo gleamed on her blouse, the blonde profile like a trick reflection of its wearer. "That was very nice," she sighed. "Though, now, an almond cake or a cherry would be ideal. Sweets are lovely, don't you think?" Mrs. Miller was perched precariously on the hassock, smoking a cigarette. Her hair and net had slipped lopsided, and loose strands straggled down her face. Her eyes were stupidly concentrated on nothing, and her cheeks were mottled in red patches, as though a fierce slap had left permanent marks. "Is there candy? A cake?" Mrs. Miller tapped ash on the rug. Her head swayed slightly as she tried to focus her eyes. "You promised to leave if I made the sandwiches." "Dear me, did I?" "It was a promise, and I'm tired. I don't feel well at all." "Mustn't fret," said Miriam. "I'm only teasing." She picked up her coat, slung it over her arm, and arranged her beret in front of the mirror. Presently she bent close to Mrs. Miller and whispered, "Kiss me. Good night." "Please, I'd rather not," said Mrs. Miller. Miriam lifted a shoulder, arched an eyebrow. "As you like," she said, and went directly to the coffee table, seized the vase containing the paper roses, carried it to where the hard surface of the floor lay bare, and hurled it downwards. Glass sprayed in all directions, and she stamped her feet on the bouquet. Then slowly she walked to the door, but before closing it, she looked back at Mrs. Miller with a slyly innocent curiosity. Mrs. Miller spent the next day in bed, rising once to feed the canary and drink a cup of tea. She took her temperature and had none, yet her dreams were feverishly agitated. Her unbalanced mood lingered, even as she lay staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. One dream threaded through the other like an elusively mysterious theme in a complicated symphony, and the scenes it depicted were sharply outlined, as though sketched by a hand of gifted intensity. A small girl, wearing a bridal gown and a wreath of leaves, led a grey procession down a mountain path, and among them there was the usual silence, till a woman at the rear asked, "Where is she taking us?" "No one knows," said an old man, marching in front. "But isn't she pretty?" volunteered a third voice. "Isn't she like a frost flower, so shining and white?" Tuesday morning, she woke up feeling better. Harsh slits of sunlight slanting through the Venetian blinds shed a disrupting light on her unwholesome fancies. She opened the window to discover a thawed, mildest spring day. A sweep of clean new clouds crumpled against a vastly blue, out-of-season sky, and across the low line of rooftops she could see a silver and smoke curving from tugboat stacks in the warm wind. A great silver truck plowed the snow-banked street, its machine sound humming in the air. After straightening the apartment, she went to the grocer's, cashed a check, and continued to Shraft's, where she ate breakfast and chatted happily with the waitress. Oh, it was a wonderful day, more like a holiday. It would be foolish to go home. She boarded a Lexington Avenue bus and rode up to 86th Street. It was here that she had decided to do a little shopping. She had no idea what she wanted or needed, but she idled along, intent only by passers-by, brisk and unpreoccupied, who gave her a disturbing sense of separateness. It was while waiting at the corner of 3rd Avenue that she saw the man. An old man, bow-legged and stooped under an armload of bulging packages. He wore a shabby brown coat and a checkered cap. Suddenly she realized they were exchanging a smile. There was nothing friendly about this smile. It was merely 2 cold flickers of recognition. But she was certain she had never seen him before. He was standing next to an E1 pillar, and she crossed the street, he turned and followed. He kept quite close. From the corner of her eye she watched his reflection wavering on the shop windows. Then in the middle of the block she stopped and faced him. He stopped also, cocked his head, grinning. But what could she say or do? Here in broad daylight on 86th Street, it was useless and despising of her own helplessness that she then quickened her steps. Now, 2nd Avenue is a dismal street made from scraps and ends, part cobblestone, part asphalt, part cement. It is the atmosphere of desertion that is permanent. Mrs. Miller walked 5 blocks without meeting anyone, and all the while the steady crunch of his footfalls on the snow stayed near. And then she came to a florist's shop. The sound was still with her. She hurried inside and watched through the glass door as the old man passed. He kept his eyes straight ahead and didn't slow his pace. But he did one strange telling thing. He tipped his cap. 6 white ones, did you say? Asked the florist. Yes, she told him. White roses. From there she went to a glassware store and selected a vase, presumably a replacement one for the one Miriam had broken, though the price was intolerable and the vase itself, she thought, grotesquely vulgar. But a series of unaccountable purchases had begun, as if by prearranged plan, a plan of which she had not the least knowledge or control of. She bought a bag of glazed cherries, and at a place called the Knickerbocker Bakery, she paid 40 cents for 6 almond cakes. Within the last hour, the weather had turned cold again, like blurred lenses. Winter clouds cast a shade over the sun, and like the skeleton of an early dark dusk coloured the sky. A damp mist mixed with the wind, and the voices of a few children who roamed high on the mountains of gutter snow seemed lonely and cheerless. Soon the first flake fell, and when Mrs. Miller reached the brownstone house, snow was falling in swift. Screen and foot tracks vanished as they were printed. The white roses were arranged decoratively in the vase. The glazed cherries shone in the ceramic plate. The almond cakes, dusted with sugar, awaited a hand. The canary fluttered on its swing and picked at a bar of seed. At precisely 5, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Miller knew who it was. The hem of her housecoat trailed as she crossed the floor. "Is that you?" she called. "Naturally," said Miriam, the word resounding shrilly from the hall. "Open this door." "Go away," said Mrs. Miller. "Please hurry. I have a heavy package." "Go away," said Mrs. Miller. She returned to the living room, lighted a cigarette, sat down, and calmly listened to the buzzer. On and on and on. You might as well leave. I have no intention of letting you in." Shortly the bell stopped. For possibly 10 minutes Mrs. Miller did not move. Then, hearing no sound, she concluded Miriam had gone. She tiptoed to the door and opened it a sliver. Miriam was half reclining atop a cardboard box, with a beautiful French doll cradled in her arms. "Really? I thought you were never coming," she said peevishly. "Here, help me in with this. It's awfully heavy." It was not spell-like compulsion that Mrs. Miller felt, but rather a curious passivity. She brought in the box. Miriam the doll. Miriam curled up on the sofa, not troubling to remove her coat or beret, and watched disinterestedly as Mrs. Miller dropped the box and stood trembling, trying to catch her breath. "Thank you," she said. In the daylight she looked pinched and drawn, her hair less luminous. The French doll she was loving wore an exquisite powdered wig, and its idiot glass eye sought solace in Miriam's. "I have a surprise," she continued. "Look into the box." Kneeling, Mrs. Miller parted the flaps and lifted up another doll. Then a blue linen dress, which she recalled as the one Miriam had worn that first night at the theatre, and of the remainder she said, "It's all clothes." "Why?" "Because I've come to live with you," said Miriam. twisting a cherry stem. "Wasn't it nice of you to buy me the cherries? But you can't. For God's sake, go away. Go away. Leave me alone. And the roses. And the almond cakes. How really wonderfully generous. You know, these cherries are delicious. The last place I lived in was with an old man. He was terribly poor, and we never had good things to eat. But I think I will be happy here." She paused to snuggle her doll closer. "Now, if you just show me where to put my things." Mrs. Miller's face dissolved into a mask of ugly red lines. She began to cry. It was an unnatural, tearless sort of weeping, as though, not having wept for a long time, she had forgotten how. Carefully she edged backward till she touched the door. She fumbled through the hall and down the stairs to the landing below. She pounded frantically on the door of the first apartment. She came to. A short, red-headed man answered, and she pushed past him. "Say, what the hell is this?" "Anything wrong, lover?" asked a young woman who appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands, and it was her that Mrs. Miller turned. "Listen, I'm ashamed, behaving this way, but, well, I'm Mrs. H.T. Miller, and I live upstairs," and she pressed her hands over her face. "It sounds so absurd." The woman guided her to a chair, while the man excitedly rattled pocket change. "Yeah? I live upstairs, and there's a little girl visiting me, and I suppose that I'm afraid of her. She won't leave, and I can't make her, and she's going to do something terrible. She's already stolen my cameo, but she's about to do something worse, something terrible." The man asked, "Is she a relative, huh?" Mrs. Miller shook her head. "I don't know who she is. Her name's Miriam, and I don't know for certain who she is." "You gotta calm down, honey," said the woman, stroking Mrs. Miller's arm. "Harry here'll tend to this kid. Go on, lover." Mrs. Miller said, "The door's open. 5A." After the man left, the woman brought a towel and bathed Mrs. Miller's face. "You're very kind," Mrs. Miller said. "I'm sorry to act like such a fool. Only this wicked child." "Sure, honey. Now, you'd better take it easy." Mrs. Miller rested her head in the crook of her arm. She was quiet enough to be asleep. The woman turned a radio dial. A piano and a husky voice filled the silence, and the woman, tapping her foot, kept excellent time. "Maybe we ought to go up, too," she said. "I don't want to see her again. I don't want to be anywhere near her." "Uh-huh. What you should have done, you should have called a cop." Presently they heard the man on the stairs. He strode into the room, frowning and scratching the back of his neck. Nobody there. She must have beat it. "Harry, you're a jerk. We've been sitting here the whole time. We would have seen." She stopped abruptly, for the man's glance was sharp. "I looked all over. There just ain't nobody there. Nobody. Understand?" "Tell me," said Mrs. Miller, rising. "Tell me, did you see a large box or a doll?" "No, ma'am, I didn't." And the woman, as if delivering a verdict, said, "Well, for crying out—" Mrs. Miller entered her apartment softly. She walked to the center of the room and stood quite still. No, in a sense, it had not changed. The roses, the cakes, the cherries were in place. But this was an empty room. Emptier than if the furnishings and familiars were not present. Lifeless, petrified as a funeral parlor. The sofa loomed before her with a new strangeness. Its vacancy had a meaning that would have been less penetrating and terrible had Miriam been curled on it. She gazed fixedly at the space where she remembered setting the box, and for a moment the hassock spun desperately. And she looked through the window. Surely the river was real, surely snow was falling. But then one could not be certain of anything. Miriam, so vividly there, and yet, where was she? Where? As though moving in a dream, she sank to a chair. The room was losing shape. It was dark and getting darker, and there was nothing to be done about it. She could not lift her hand to light a lamp. Suddenly closing her eyes, she felt an upward surge, like a diver emerging from some deeper, greener depth. In times of terror or immense distress, there are moments when the wind waits as though for a revelation, while a skein of calm is woven over thought. It is like a sleep or a supernatural trance, and during this lull one is aware of a force of quiet reasoning. Well, what if she had never really known a girl named Miriam? What if she had been foolishly frightened on the street? In the end, like everything else, it was of no importance. For the only thing she had lost to Miriam was her identity. But now she knew she had found it again. The person who lived in this room, who cooked her own meals, who owned a canary, who was someone she could trust and believe in, was Mrs. H.T. Miller. Listening in contentment, she became aware of a double sound, a bureau drawer opening and closing. She seemed to hear it long after completion, opening and closing. Then gradually the harshness of it was replaced by the murmur of a silk dress, and this delicately faint was moving nearer, swelling in intensity, till the walls trembled with the vibration, and the room was caving under a wave of whispers. Mrs. Miller stiffened and opened her eyes to a dull, direct stare. "Hello," said Miriam. Miriam by Truman Capote. Mangled by me, Gav Cross. Read from the St. Michael book 65, Great Tales of Horror. Or is it? Ooh, invisible book. Thank you very much for letting me chew the scenery there. Creepy, says Barry. See, if you're watching this live, there is a live chat. I'd love to know what you thought of the story, even the reading, certainly the accents. Very creepy, says Pablo. One of those stories with with an unopen, with a open ending. Yeah. Terrifying, says Claire. Has anybody read much Truman Capote before? I read In Cold Blood a long time ago. I feel like I'm probably at the right age to read it again. It put the willies up you, did it, Short and Hairy? Oh my gosh. Oh, Miss Gibson, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. Thank you. That is very kind of you. That support. Miss Gibson has gifted a sub to Fodor. Fodor is a resident of Alaska. Thank you. Hi, says Danny. There's the little ping. Very much enjoyed that. Oh, you're very kind. Thank you, thank you. Well, you're very welcome here. We're here every Monday. Little spooky story. And then it goes all nonsense. Seeing all the pings there. Oh, I missed that ping. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm at the right age to reread Truman Capote now, who was a really interesting guy. I remember there were two films where he was a character in it. There was one with the English actor who's in These Hectorists, who looks like him, and then another one with Philip Seymour Hoffman, who was a really very interesting guy. And there was a comment, Barry, and I appreciate where it's coming from, about he didn't look much fun. He was big fun. He was a big socialite party guy. There you go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this stream, stay put or refresh. I'll come back and we'll have a chat, and you can tell me what you've been reading, tell me what you've been watching, tell me what you would recommend. But for now, and you can also slide away into shifty oblivion, I'm going to end this stream and then start another one. So either stay or refresh. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for taking part. Thank you very much for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, come and join us live on Twitch. If you're watching live on Twitch, I'll be right back. Don't go away.